African Studies, Elliott School of International Affairs, George Washington University. Ms. Naledi Maite, Program Director, Zanele Mbeki Development Trust. Ms. Linda Vilagasi, African Women in Dialogue, South African Chapter. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite the following to participate in this meeting: Her Excellency Ms. Fatima Kaira Mohammed, Permanent Representative of African Union to the United Nations, and Her Excellency Ms. Jean Area Biage, Permanent Observer of the Economic Community for Central African States to the United Nations. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of I wish to draw the attention of the Council members to document S/2019/786, a letter dated 2 of October 2019 from a permanent representative of South Africa to United Nations, the Secretary General, transmitting a concept paper on the item under consideration. I wish to warmly welcome Secretary General Antonio Guterres, Your Excellency, and give you the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, Mr. President, for this opportunity to brief the Council on the United Nations work on preventive diplomacy, conflict prevention, and resolution in Africa. All our work on conflict prevention and resolution relies on partnerships with member states, regional and sub-regional organizations, and regional economic communities and others. And the African Union is our key strategic partner across the continent. And I welcome the leadership of His Excellency Mr. Moussa Faki Muhammad, Chairperson of the African Union Commission, that has participated in so many of our debates. Mr. President, we are making progress on conflict prevention together with our partners in many parts of Africa. In the Gambia, for example, joint action by the African Union, the Economic Community of West African States, and the United Nations and neighboring countries prevented the political crisis from spiraling in and supported a peaceful and democratic transition 2 years ago. In Madagascar, we worked with the African Union, the European Union, the Southern African Development Community, and the International Organization de la Francophonie to facilitate dialogue, which contributed to the peaceful presidential election last year. Our Good Office's efforts, together with those of the African Union, the Community of Portuguese-speaking countries, Ecowas, and the European Union, have been instrumental in addressing political tensions in Guinea-Bissau. And I urge all parties to work for a peaceful, transparent, free and fair election next month. In Cameroon, my special representative for Central Africa is working with the authorities and with national and regional stakeholders to support efforts to address the root causes of the crisis in the northwest and southwest regions through an inclusive dialogue. And the conclusions of the national dialogue have just been published. The recent agreement in Sudan, brokered by the African Union and Ethiopia, is an opportunity for the international community to support peace at a delicate time in a country that has seen terrible conflict and suffering. And my special representative for West Africa and the Sahel conducted joint efforts with ECOWAS and the African Union to support peaceful and inclusive election processes in Sierra Leone, Nigeria and Senegal. Monsieur le Président, le terrorisme est une menace croissante pour tout le continent et avec de graves implications pour la paix et la sécurité dans le monde. Au Sahel, des groupes terroristes attaquent régulièrement les forces de sécurité locales et internationales. Nous avons eu encore un mort hier, y compris nos casques bleus de la MINUSMA. La violence se propage vers les États côtiers du Golfe de Guinée. Au Nigeria, Boko Haram et ses factions dissidentes terrorisent les communautés locales et attaque les forces de sécurité malgré les efforts de la force multinationale mixte. Et nous voyons des réseaux terroristes se propager dans toute la Libye et l'Afrique du Nord, s'étendre à travers le Sahel jusqu'à la région du Tchad et apparaître en République démocratique du Congo et au Mozambique. C'est une bataille que nous ne sommes pas en train de gagner. Il ne s'agit pas seulement d'une question régionale, mais d'un danger évident et immédiat pour la paix et la sécurité dans le monde. Je me félicite du sommet de la CEDEAO qui
I
s'est tenu
welcome
le mois
last
dernier
month's
à
ECOWAS
Ouagadougou
summit in Burkina
et de
Faso in
l'engagement renouvelé
Ouagadougou
des États
and the
membres de
renewed
la
commitment
CEDEAO à
of the ECOWAS
participer
member states to
financièrement et
participate both
militairement
financially
à la
and
lutte contre le
militarily
terrorisme.
in the fight against terrorism.
Nous devons prendre conscience
We
que
must
la
recognize
répercussion de la
that the
crise
impacts of the crisis in Libya is growing and spreading throughout the region as weapons and fighters continually move across borders. As you know, my special representative is working with national, regional and international partners to prevent a further escalation of violence and promote a return to the political process. I have already sent the President of the Security Council a copy of the letter from the President of the African Union Commission presenting the proposal from the Peace and Security Council of the African Union to this Council, and I look forward to enhanced cooperation with the African Union on Libya. Peace in Mali is also essential to peace in the Sahel. Despite the terrible attacks in the Mopti region last week, I hope plans for an inclusive political dialogue, the terms of reference of which have been agreed, will facilitate the implementation of the 2015 peace agreement. Our peacekeeping mission, MINUSMA, plays a critical role in supporting the implementation of the agreement and requires continued strong support. African military operations, including AMISOM, the G5 Sahel Joint Force, the Multinational Joint Task Force against Boko Haram, and others, deserve our support. I welcome your decision to lift geographic restrictions on provisions by MINUSMA to the G5 Sahel Joint Force. But this alone is not enough. I urge you again to provide African peace-enforcing and counter-terrorist operations with clear mandates, backed by predictable and sustainable financial support through assessed contributions. Mr. President, sustainable, inclusive development is an end in itself. It is also the most effective way to address the underlying causes of conflict, extremism and terrorism. Tackling poverty and building resilient, tackling poverty and inequality, strengthening state institutions and civil society, and promoting human rights are essential to preventing conflict and building resilient communities and societies. These goals are central to both the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the African Union's Agenda 2063. We are working in full alignment with the AU through our joint framework on sustainable development for a peaceful and prosperous Africa, with a strong focus on inclusivity, women's rights and gender equality. Women's meaningful participation and leadership will strengthen our responses and are essential to lasting peace. Addressing the climate crisis is another vital preventive measure. Climate-related risks, including droughts, floods, and changing rainfall patterns, often intersect with political, social, and economic factors. We must urgently reduce emissions to prevent catastrophic consequences for sustainable development and security across Africa, and step up support for the countries most affected. Today, it is indisputable that climate change has aggravated security challenges, particularly in the Sahel. Nearly half of Africa's population of 1.3 billion are under the age of 15. Education, training, and job opportunities for this generation must be central to any development strategy. As we saw most recently in Sudan, women and young people are key builders of peaceful societies. I urge you to work with them and for them far more effectively.
Mr. President, when prevention fails, the United Nations work with our partners to reduce suffering, resolve conflicts, and build sustainable peace. We strongly support the African Union's Silence the Guns 2020 initiative as a basis for advancing peace and security and offering a safer and better future. I commend the Security Council for its resolution on this initiative and for emphasizing the role of young people. Our enhanced strategic partnership with the African Union on peace and security is based on the Joint Framework Agreement of 2017. It was demonstrated again in February when this Council unanimously adopted Resolution 2457 on steps towards ending conflict in Africa through enhanced international cooperation and partnership. Our largest peacekeeping missions are on the African continent, and more than 80,000 peacekeepers serve there. And Africa is now the largest troop-contributing region. We owe these Blue Helmets our strong and united support through robust funding and strong mandates. I commend the Council's cooperation with the African Union, including with the AU's Peace and Security Council. Across the continent, the United Nations is working in steadfast and close cooperation with the African Union and African sub-regional organizations to prevent and resolve conflicts. The Central African Republic is just one example. The United Nations, the African Union and others are cooperating in support of the historic agreement reached in February to end violence against civilians, strengthen the extension of state authority, and bring social development to this conflict-ravaged country. Mr. President, conflict prevention is difficult to quantify and may not make news. But no news is good news for the people we serve. Prevention brings enormous rewards. Conflict prevention and resolution depend on the engagement of the parties involved. Beyond that, they require a united international position and a commitment to shared goals. The Council's strong engagement in prevention of efforts on the African continent, in collaboration with regional and sub-regional partners, is needed and appreciated more than ever. Thank you.
I thank the Secretary General for his briefing. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ms. Liberata Mulamula. You have the floor.
Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, members of the Council, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. At the outset, allow me to express to you, Mr. President, to express my gratitude to you, Mr. President, for organizing this extremely important debate on the centrality of preventive diplomacy, conflict prevention and resolution in addressing the agenda for peace and security in Africa. I'm so honored and humbled to be among the invited briefers and been given this opportunity, the first opportunity, to share with the Council my experience and our call with regard to the role of women in peace building and conflict resolution. Mr. President, before I do that, I wish to congratulate you on presiding over the work of the Council this month of October, which is an important month in the history of the United Nations. The world is widely witnessing the erosion of multilateralism and its contribution to make the world a better place for all of us to live. The fact that the Council is debating on the primacy of preventive diplomacy is a stark reminder that we have not lived to the raison d'etre of the United Nations, in which we, the people of the United Nations, declared our determination to save the succeeding generation from the scourge of war. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, Excellencies, as you deliberate on the important steps required to strengthen preventive diplomacy, allow me to flag some of the issues arising from my own experience in the various peace processes, as well as the women platforms which have been privileged to participate. I come from Tanzania, a country that has played an extraordinary role in conflict resolution, preventive diplomacy, peace building in the Great Lakes region and beyond. Therefore, I wish to state here that my career path has exposed me to conflict resolution, managing conflict, and seeking negotiated solution. I was privileged, Mr. President, to serve as the first executive secretary of the International Conference on the Great Lakes region. The evolution of this organization is traced from the Rwanda genocide and the wars that embroidered the Great Lakes region between 1994 to 2004. This regional framework constitutes the regional responses to the violent conflicts and genocide that plagued the region. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, every peace initiatives, every interventions, mediations processes, concepts, frameworks, legal instruments, you name it, have been tried in the Great Lakes region. The signing of the Pact on Peace, Stability and Development in the Great Lakes region that established the International Conference on the Great Lakes region was seen as a milestone that demonstrated the strong political will of states in the region to build structures and expand the scope of responsibility to prevention beyond governments. This brought on board the civil society, the women and youth groups. The follow-up mechanisms that were established, which included a summit of the heads of state, the regional ministerial council, the secretariat, and the national coordination mechanisms, were to ensure that appropriate measures are established to prevent conflicts escalating to violence and mass atrocity levels. Mr. President, the complexity of the issues involved and the cyclic violence meant that any meaningful attempt to address the issues of peace and security in the region and the African continent must be premised on a regional framework and regional approach. As countries in the region have a better understanding of the situation on the ground than maybe external actors. Though with time, the assessment of legitimacy and the role of the countries in the region having common interests has been put to question, and the scholars have written so much about this. Let me emphasize that despite the few political instabilities remaining and the many unresolved issues, at least the guns are silent in that part of the region for now. Had the enormous responsibility to sustainably transform legacies and cycles of violent conflicts and genocide to peaceful coexistence between communities and countries of the region. It was not an easy task, but as the saying goes, if you want to get something done, give it to a woman. And if you want it well said, give it to a man. I was to facilitate dialogue to prevent, contain, and manage situations that are likely to affect peace and security, and seek to identify potential triggers of intrastate and interstate hostilities. Mr. President, in reading one of the reports of the UN Conflict Prevention and Preventive in Action, I get the nostalgia that the use of the Secretary General's good offices by deploying special envoys and representatives in conflict areas are more directed in the attempt to prevent conflicts or crises from escalating rather than preventing them before they occur. There are reported successes in Mali, Burkina Faso, Colombia, and others, but it's always sometimes too little, too late. I recall at the peak of the political crisis in Burundi, the peace-building commission configuration for Burundi was supposed to undertake a mission to Burundi, and we on the ground were eagerly waiting for the enforcement from the peace-building commission. But at the last minute, the mission was cancelled because of what was said as the security situation in the country, while the leaders from the region were flowing in Burundi. So, Mr. President, allow me, because I assume, seeing the briefers around the table, that this debate will be centered, among others, on the women, peace, and security agenda. At the 205 World Summit, the world leaders reaffirmed the important role of women in conflict prevention, resolution, and peace building. They called for the full and effective implementation of the Security Council Resolution 1325 on women and peace and security. And for the first time, they accepted the linkages across development, peace, and security and human rights. In addition, and further to the obligations under the UN Security Council Resolution above, the United Nations and the Great Lakes region, which I know most, adopted a framework for peace, security, and cooperation for the DRC and the region in February 2013, as well as the Women Platform. The Women Platform in that volatile region, which I'm its integral part, provides a framework for promoting the important role of women in peace and political processes in the region, as well as contribute to the much desired stability by participating in creating the requisite conditions for peace and development in the region, among others. The remarkable thing worth reporting here, Mr. President, is that though the platform was initiated and launched by Her Excellency Madam Mary Robinson, the then UN Secretary General Special Envoy to the Great Lakes region, our successors, who are both men, Ambassador Dijinit, and the current Special Envoy, Ambassador Shea, have made this their flagship program for the preventive diplomacy and peace building in the region with tremendous success. The joint UN peace missions we have conducted in Burundi, Central African Republic, DRC, and Sudan would not have been possible without their full support in terms of resources and political will. I wish to salute them for being the outstanding model of the E for She campaign in words and deeds. Mr. President, despite all these instruments and national action plans and mechanisms for implementation, equal representation and demonstrated influence of women on policies related to peace and security are not yet achieved. Violence against women remains perhaps the most pervasive human rights violation in the African continent and in the region in particular. The absence of and lack of African women participation in formal mediation processes at the peace table in particular is an important area of the UN Security Council 1325 agenda that remains poorly implemented. In addition, women's significant contribution to a strong role in subnational and local mediation and conflict prevention initiatives continue to be largely unrecognized and weakly supported. It is against this backdrop, Mr. President, that the African Union took landmark decisions leading to the establishment of the Network of African Women in Conflict Prevention and Mediation, officially referred to as FemWise Africa. The modalities of its operations were endorsed by the AU Peace and Security Council on 13 March 2017 and got additional endorsement by this August body on 27 March 2017 as part of an AREA formula meeting. Mr. President, with your indulgence, allow me to explain a bit more about FemWise Africa, which I find of direct relevance to the objectives of this debate on preventive diplomacy and the peace and security in Africa. FemWise, as its name suggests, aims to strengthen the role of women in conflict prevention and mediation efforts in the context of the African peace and security architecture. The network provides a platform for strategic advocacy capacity building, and networking aimed at enhancing the implementation of the commitments for women's inclusion in peacemaking in Africa. Among its priorities is professionalizing the role of women in preventive diplomacy and mediation at tracks 1, 2, and 3 levels, and ensuring a channel for women's meaningful and effective participation in peace processes. In all, Mr. President, FemWise aims at bridging the gap between track 1, 2, and 3 mediation and synergizing efforts towards inclusive peace processes with sustainable outcomes. We were in Burundi in the month of June this year on a joint peace mission of the FemWise Africa and UN Office of the Special Envoy to the Great Lakes region. Under the leadership, this mission was under the leadership of Her Excellency Mama Catherine Samba Panza, the interim president of Central Africa Republic, and Her Excellency Mama Spenciosa Kazibwe, the former vice president of Uganda, now a member of the panel of the wise of the African Union. The objective of this mission, Mr. President, was to engage the authorities in Burundi and Central African Republic and DRC to involve the women, the civil society, and other stakeholders for dialogue. And in Burundi specifically, as they head towards the general elections, hopefully next year, we thought this was timely to be able to engage all stakeholders in this preventive diplomacy. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, what struck us most, among others, is how the Burundi have been receptive to FemWise and localized to their situations. With the support of the Gender Ministry, they have formed mediation teams at the community level, drawing inspiration from FemWise to mitigate conflicts and tension among communities before they escalate to crisis level. This is one of the good practices of preventive diplomacy at the local and grassroots level, which needs to be upscaled and supported if we have to achieve sustained peace and development in that country. The AU has involved women in its initiative of silencing the guns by 2020. We met in Constantine, Algeria, to see how best we can play our role in ensuring that the African Union meets these aspirations. We'll be celebrating next year the anniversaries of the landmark aspirations, including 20 years of the UN Security Council 1325, 25 years of Beijing Platform of Action, which is a mother of the 30% gender quotas of women, for women representation, and of course, silencing the guns in Africa by 2020. The question, Mr. President, is will the guns be silent in Africa come 2020? The African Women Leaders Network, which was launched in June 2017 here at the United Nations headquarters, jointly by the African Union Commission and the United Nations in partnership with the Federal Republic of Germany, aims to bolster the leadership of women in governance, peace and security for Africa's transformation, including participating actively in seeing that women play a meaningful role in silencing the guns through our advocacy and sensitization of communities. As a coordinator of the peace and security pillar of the network, I call on the Council to recognize these efforts and support the network with the necessary resources to make a difference. I'm proud to report that the network, under the able leadership of Mama Amina Mohamed, the UN Deputy Secretary General, Mama Pumzile Mlambo Nguka, UN Women Executive Director, and Mama Bineta Diop, the AU Special Envoy on Peace and Security, has set the goal of generating sustainable and concrete actions for women in Africa, in line with the African Union and the United Nations commitments to prevention and delivering tangible solutions on the ground. Mr. President, women do not need to prove their substantive impact to find solutions to the drivers of armed conflict and displacement, but to reinforce their proactive role played by the women in peace building and sustainable development. I'm encouraged by the UN Secretary General's initiative for making prevention the overarching priority for achieving peace and development. Your meeting here, Mr. President, is a clear testimony of the commitment of states and the Council to take deliberate measures to prevent conflicts, mass atrocity in Africa and worldwide. My humble appeal to the Council is to put money where our mouth is, namely to invest in conflict prevention and efforts that target the root causes and drivers of violence. It is high time, Mr. President, to see women not as victims, but agents of preventive diplomacy and playing a catalytic role to peace building. I'm again privileged to be a member of the Secretary General's Advisory Group on Peace Building, where the programs of women empowerment and youth have been accorded priority. Though, Mr. Secretary General, we are still seen wanting in engaging effectively and meaningful local women organizations due to hamstrung financial regulations and criteria that govern your fund. They need to be changed in line with your commitment to seeing the women play a meaningful role in preventive diplomacy, conflict resolution, peace building, sustainable development. Mr. President, finally, drawing from the aforementioned, let me just conclude with few recommendations. First and foremost, Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General's Excellencies, there is no need, as you deliberate on this preventive diplomacy, there is no need to reinvent the wheel, as the mechanisms, frameworks, legal instruments exist, including the regional mechanisms, the national action plans drawn under the UN Security Council 1325 for women that remain unimplemented due to lack of resources and, of course, maybe the political will for implementation. Secondly, a regional or sub-regional approach, need to emphasize, should be the primary and most appropriate response mechanism for preventive diplomacy in Africa. Thirdly, we see that the annual cost of more than $1 billion for maintaining the peacekeeping force, for example, in DRC. Mr. President, Mr. Secretary General, this money would go a long way in implementing, for example, the national action plans that would translate commitments on women, peace and security into national policies and programs of many African countries. Thirdly, Mr. President, I call on the Council to support and enhance capacity of African regional organizations and women engaged in conflict prevention and mediation through the FemWise and the other women platforms. The focus should be on proactive conflict prevention before conflict escalates, more than reactive conflict prevention, preventing conflict that have already occurred. The various initiatives taken at the international and regional level will have no effect if they work in isolation from the local initiatives and ensuring local ownership for sustainability. The regional blocs, as mentioned in your statement, Mr. Secretary General, have assumed a vital role in conflict resolution through mediation efforts, despite, of course, challenges they face. I think they need to be capacitated and supported. Finally, I see there's a need to develop a holistic and inclusive approach that ensures that no one is left behind in the Agenda 2016, 2063, and Development Agenda 2030 that have placed women and youth at the center of their aspirations. It goes without saying that collaboration and cooperation with various institutions and communities that are active in this field is essential. I participate in various preventive frameworks, including the Global Action Against Mass Atrocity, GAMAC, which was mentioned in your report, Mr. Secretary General. This is a global, inclusive, state-led network of partners with the support of the Swiss government, which is involved in atrocity prevention. It intends to support states that wish to develop national architectures for prevention of atrocity crimes. I invite you to work closely with such institutions. And finally, dialogue and mediation are vital soft power approaches that should be engaged as the Council reflects on the centrality and value of preventive diplomacy. As a woman peace activist and champion of women leadership, Mr. President, the subject that I teach, let me conclude here by saying that nothing about us without us. This is a famous say in Burundi. Mr. Secretary General, we are here and ready and willing to be deployed in any peace mission, in any mediation, in any peacekeeping forces. Don't look far. The African Women Leaders Network and FemWise are at your disposal, Mr. Secretary General, when you are searching for able and qualified women to assist in your good offices and diplomatic efforts. The South African legendary singer, Yvonne Chaka Chaka, defined women, Mr. Secretary General, as well-organized men. So we are together in this. I thank you once again, Mr. President, for the opportunity. Amandra, aluta continua. Thank you.
I want to thank Her Excellency.